So hello everybody, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you Philippe Aghion, Professor of Economics at the Collège de France, INSEAD, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Philippe is a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. During his career, he received many awards for his seminal work. In 2001, he was recipient of Piero Hanson Award, in 2009 of the John von Neumann Award, and in 2016 of the Global Entrepreneurship Award. His research focuses on the economics of growth. With Peter Howitt, he pioneered the so-called Schumpeterian growth paradigm, which was subsequently used to analyze the design of growth policies and the state's role in the growth process. Much of this work, originally published in top scientific journals, is summarized in their joint books, Endogenous Growth Theory and the Economics of Growth. In his book with Rachel Griffith on competition and growth, in the survey paper, What Do We Learn from Schumpeterian Growth Theory, and in his most recent book, The Power of Creative Distraction, on which today's keynote is based. Philippe today will tell us about the process of creative distraction and how these concepts provide a framework to understand the inner dynamics at work in our capitalist societies and the current transition towards a post-COVID context. The recent crisis has clearly shown the serious problems plaguing our economic, social, and political systems. It has shown, for instance, the dysfunctional social welfare and healthcare systems in the US and the mounting social distress against a structurally unequal and unfair allocation of income and wealth. The crisis has also shown the inadequate innovation system in Europe and the missed opportunities for growth that originated from a divided Europe. It has shown the lack of transparency and the excess concentration of power in China and Russia. The crisis has finally shown the potential implication of a failed transition to a more sustainable production model worldwide. But the crisis is also an opportunity for change, to rethinking capitalism, to empower the process of creative distraction while softening its impact on employment and people's quality of life, health, and happiness, to direct creative distraction towards greener and more equitable growth, and finally, to avoid excessive concentration of wealth and power, threatening our democracies and the process of economic growth itself. Without further ado, Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So I will present my book, The Power of Creative Distraction, which is joined with Céline Antonin. She's a researcher at Sciences Po, and Simon Bunel, who is a researcher at Banque de France and INSEAD. So creative distraction is a term coined by Schumpeter to refer to the innovations displacing old technologies. It's the process whereby new innovations make old technologies obsolete. Okay, for example, if you read Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, you can see, Schumpeter explaining this concept, okay? But when I studied growth, there was no model based on this concept. It was just an idea. There was no theory, there was no empirics. When I studied growth, we studied Harold Domar, Solo, Ramsey, models without innovation, actually, very much model based on capital accumulation, growth models. And so in 1987, with Peter Howitt, we decided to construct a new growth model, which embodies the notion of creative destruction. And the model would revolve around three main ideas. The first idea is that long-run growth is driven by a cumulative process of innovation where each innovator builds upon previous innovation. The second idea is that innovations do not come from heaven. They result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation rents. Okay? And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovation displace old technologies. But you can see right away that at the heart of the growth process described in this way, there is a contradiction. On the one hand, you need innovation rents to motivate innovators. And in fact, you are motivated by the fact that if you innovate, you get temporary, at least, monopoly rents because you are better than other. You do a new product or new process, or okay, and it's the prospect of these rents that encourages you to innovate in the first place, to invest in R&D and all that. But on the other hand, those rents can be used ex post to prevent future innovations and to block new entry, because yesterday's innovators, they will be very tempted to use their own innovation rents to block subsequent innovation because they don't want themselves to be subject to creative destruction. And regulating capitalism, it's all about this contradiction. Whether we will talk about the growth takeoff, whether we talk about secular stagnation, inequality, the middle income trap, wherever we are, green innovation, we come across this contradiction between the fact that you need a monopoly rents to motivate innovation, but those rents can be used ex post to prevent subsequent innovation. Schumpeter himself was deeply pessimistic about the future of capitalism because he thought that first innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would successfully bribe the state and prevent subsequent innovation. In fact, in this book, we are more optimistic. We are more like Gramscian optimists. You know, Gramsci, you know better Gramsci than I do. And the optimism, the fighting optimism. So I am more like of a Gramscian optimist than a Schumpeter pessimist. Voilà. We are Schumpeterian, but more optimist than Schumpeter, because we believe that there are forces that can be activated to avert the pessimistic prediction of Schumpeter. And I will tell you more about what these forces are. Okay. Okay, so what we do in this book is to use the lens of creative destruction and of the paradigm I outlined above to do three main things. To revisit some main enigmas in economic history. Second, to question some common wisdoms. Third, to rethink the future of capitalism. So let me talk about those three, each of those three in turn. Some historical enigma. One historical enigma is the industrial takeoff, the growth takeoff. In fact, growth as we know it nowadays is a very recent phenomenon. Prior to 1800, there was essentially no growth worldwide. There's been episodes of growth. Venice has had a period of growth before, other places, but it was never lasting growth. And if you look worldwide at per capita GDP worldwide, you see no growth until the early 19th century. And the growth takeoff, which happens here, takes place very much in Europe, not in China. Very strange, because China had been a country of many important innovations, starting with the wheel, the compass, many things. Even the spaghetti were invented in China, as you know. It's Marco Polo brought them back from China. So why is it that the takeoff did not take place in China? And there, chapter 2 of the book deals with that. And the work of Joël Mokyr is, in this respect, illuminating. Joël Mokyr tells you, and it amazingly follows, if you put all Joël Mokyr together, you get back to the paradigm that I mentioned, that I outlined with Peter Howitt. The first thing is that Mokyr explains very well that in Europe, you had institutions that would favor cumulative innovation. In particular, universities, with the openness that you have in universities in Europe, and the Encyclopedia Britannica, or the French Encyclopedia of Diderot, the Enlightenment, that would codify knowledge and make it easier for people to invent based on previous knowledge, you see, because the knowledge would be codified. So you had those things in Europe that you didn't have anywhere else, which is the result of the Enlightenment that would make it possible to have cumulative innovation. The second thing is that in Europe, you had institutions that would protect property rights. Very important, because otherwise you could always be expropriated by the king or the aristocracy. That's the case in China. In China, no guarantee for an innovator that he would not be or she would not be expropriated or silenced by the king. And in England was not the case because you had the Glorious Revolution, and the Glorious Revolution led to institutions that protect property rights. Same thing in France. You had the French Revolution followed by Napoleon that led to institutions that protect property rights. So you need those to get these monopoly rents to reward innovation. And creative destruction also in Europe, and that Mokir explains very well, it's very much linked to the competition between European countries. If in China, as I said before, in fact, not only established firms would be against new firms, but the emperor himself would be against new innovators because he would feel threatened by new innovators. But in Europe, if you would persecute an inventor, the inventor could flee to neighboring European countries that compete with this European country. For example, an inventor in France, if the French state bothers him, he could flee to England, Switzerland, Prussia, and invent there. And those countries competed with France. So this competition between European countries helped sustain creative destruction in Europe. You see, that's very interesting how conditions were there in Europe in the early 19th century for each of those three crucial ingredients to be enforceable. Okay, so that explains why, you know, takeoff took place in Europe in 1900 and not before and not elsewhere. So the second enigma is secular stagnation. If you look at average annual TFP growth in the US, you see that it went up a lot between 1995 and 2005, but then went down a lot since 2005. And that's strange because you had the IT revolution, the telecom, information telecommunication revolution, and you had the AI, the artificial intelligence revolution. Those should allow much faster growth. But what you observe is that you have slower growth. How come? So we talk about that in chapter 6 of the book. We entertain various explanations. Maybe ideas are harder to get. Maybe growth is not well measured, etc. And there is truth to all of those. But the most plausible explanation, we believe, for the decline in TFP growth in the US is that during the between 1995 and 2005, you had the IT revolution that led to the development of new superstar firms, Google, Microsoft, Walmart, then Facebook, etc. Okay, and those firms, when they grew, that spurred growth in the US. That's why you have this boost of growth between 1995 and 2005. But then what happened is that these firms spread out through all the sectors of the US economy, in particular using mergers and acquisition, okay? And eventually they became tentacular. You see, they invaded the whole US economy and they ended up inhibiting entry by non-superstar firms. And here, if you look at, so here, by the way, you can see that this rise followed by decline of TFP growth is mainly in IT producing sectors, which is the black curve, and IT using sectors, which is the gray curve, okay? So it has to do with the IT. But what's interesting is that you have that entry of firms, of non-superstar firms, goes up between this period and then goes down. Since the early 2000s, entry of new firms has gone down. So the big problem is that competition policy has not been adapted to the digital time. We let those superstar firms expand through mergers and acquisition without any limit and without asking whether this merger and acquisition would prevent or discourage subsequent entry and subsequent innovation. And that's the big problem. But you see the difference with Gordon or with Schumpeter is that Gordon will tell you there is nothing that you can do, although I think he's changing his mind. And Schumpeter would have told you, here you see, it's exactly what I said. You have these innovators that turn into conglomerates and they discourage subsequent innovation. But you see where we differ in this book is that we say, no, there is something to be done. You can reform competition policy. You can reform the practice of antitrust policy. You see, in particular, we are very interested in recent work that advocates that, you know, when you decide whether or not to allow for new merger and acquisition, you should not just look at market share and market definition. You should look at whether the merger and acquisition will prevent subsequent entry and subsequent innovation. You should have a much more dynamic practice of antitrust. And that's, for example, Richard Gilbert from Berkeley advocates this, and other people as well. And we believe that if we manage to change competition policy, we can avert, we can put an end to the secular stagnation. And in fact, under the Biden administration 1 year ago, you had sweeping reforms of the competition policy in the US. Hopefully, it will give us something. And that's what we do about the secular stagnation. Okay. What you can see, by the way, is that that's the emergence of the superstar firms. Markups have gone up, but very much because not so much because within firm markups have gone up, it is because, in fact, it's a between firm effect that the high markup firms, which are the superstar firms, have become much more hegemonic within the economy. That's the black curve. You see the reallocation component of markup is not because it's within, you see, within firm markups have not gone up so much. It's really because the reallocation component is because the high markup firms, which are the superstar firms, the Google, Microsoft, have become much more hegemonic in the US economy. But by doing that, they have discouraged new entry, and competition policy and renewal of competition policy is the solution to this problem. Okay, I take 1 minute of breathing. Now I will talk about middle income trap. We talk about very often about the Argentinian syndrome. Here I'm showing the per capita GDP of Argentina divided by per capita GDP of the US. And you see that, in fact, between 1870 and 1930, this ratio of the Argentinian per capita GDP divided by US per capita GDP is constant, approximately. Means that the Argentina more or less grows at the same rate as the US. But since 1930, Argentina grows less fast than the US. So there is something that happened there. Korea is another example. I show you the growth rate of per capita GDP, and you see it's pretty high, and it keeps increasing up to the 1990. And since the early 1990, the growth rate of per capita GDP in Korea declines. So what happened? And what happened is that you see there are two ways to generate productivity growth. And that's very much based on work I did with Acemoglu and Zilibotti, and this middle income trap I talk about in chapter 7 of the book. So one way to grow is to imitate the frontier technology, which we call A-bar here. That's one way to generate productivity growth. You catch up with the technological frontier. You imitate the technological frontier. Another way is to innovate upon yourself, to turn A into gamma A, where gamma is greater than 1. That's what I call frontier innovation. Now, if you are very far below the frontier, it's mainly the mu-m that will be the engine of growth. I mean, you will grow mainly by catching up. That's what Korea did up to 1990. That's what China did until recently. That's what Japan did after World War II. Very much catching up growth, okay? And you need some kind of institutions for that. You need, you need various institutions, for example, to absorb foreign knowledge. Trade is important. Basic education is important. That's what I think. Now, once A gets close to A-bar, it is frontier innovation that becomes the main engine of growth. But you see, the institutions that are good for the mu-n are not the same institutions that are good for the mu-m. In particular, competition is important for the mu-n. You see here, I'm showing you innovation and growth at firm level as a function of competition in the sector. You see that if you are a firm close to the technological frontier in your sector, that's the blue line, competition boosts innovation because you innovate to remain the best, to escape competition with potential rivals. But if you are a firm far below the technological frontier in your sector, you are already discouraged, and competition, more competition, will discourage you even more. Think of a classroom. You are all very good. Suppose some of you are better than others. And suppose that I open the door of the classroom and I let in a very good new pupil. Then the best in the class will work harder to remain the first of the class in spite of this new entrant. But those who are at the bottom of the class, they are already discouraged. They will be even more discouraged when I let this new very good pupil in. It's exactly the same for firms, you see. So now, when you are a country closer to the technological frontier worldwide, closer to the productivity level of the US, it means that you have more blue firms than orange firms. The more advanced the country is, the more blue firms it has compared to orange firms, and therefore the more growth enhancing competition will be. You see, so the thing is that I want to tell you that when you are far below the frontier and you are growing through imitation, it's no big deal if you don't have competition policy. But if you become now a country close to the frontier where most of the firms are blue, it becomes really important to have competition policy. Now, the problem of the middle income trap is that Korea, you see, during the catching up period, the conglomerates developed in Korea. We call them the chobols. And these conglomerates, not only they discourage entry of non-chobol firms, but they also managed to put pressure on the government to not implement more competition. Because as Korea become closer to the technological frontier, they should have moved from institutions that are good for mu-m to institutions that are good for mu-n. But the conglomerates that had grown during the period of catch-up of Korea, they didn't want to move from institutions that are good for mu-m into institutions that are good for mu-n. In particular, they didn't want the government of Korea to implement more competitive policies. And it took the crisis of the late 90s, you know, they went through financial crisis of the late 90s to weaken the power of the conglomerates. And that in turn, not only boosted entry and innovation of non-chobol firms, of non-conglomerates, but it also forced the Korean government to implement, you know, more competition. And as a result, in fact, growth resumed after that period. The growth that had gone down in Korea after 1990 went through a boost again because the chobols were weakened by the financial crisis. So that explains to you. So again, you have the Schumpeter fear that, you know, you have conglomerates that develop and prevent the thing. But here is the crisis that weakened the power of the chobols and made it possible to resume higher growth in Korea. Okay, let me breathe for 1 minute or 2 minutes. Okay, now I want to talk about inequality. If you look at the share of income of the top 1% income earners in the US, you see that it goes up sharply since 1980. And that's very much the work of Piketty, Saez, Atkinson. Okay, and they show that not only for US, but also for most developed countries. Okay, so that's a fact. Top income inequality has gone up. Now, the question is, why did it go up? And what I want to argue there is that there are several sources of top income inequality, at least 2 of them. one source is innovation, and I will get back to that, because when you innovate, you become rich if you are a successful innovator. Another source is lobbying and entry barriers. You can just be rich because you have a monopoly that you preserve through entry barriers. So there is the story of Steve Jobs, who becomes rich because he invents Apple, but you have also Carlos Slim, who becomes rich because he is at the head of a non-regulated telecom monopoly in Mexico. Okay, those are two different ways to be rich, but they have very different implications for social mobility and for growth. Innovation, as I will, has the advantage that it increases growth. Innovation is good for growth. So already that I like. But I will show you now that innovation increases top income inequality. It increases social mobility at the same time. And as a result, it does not increase broad measures of inequality like the Gini. So why does it increase top income inequality? Because Steve Jobs became rich because he invented Apple. Zuckerberg became rich because he invented Facebook. Elon Musk because he invented, oh God, I forgot. I should know the, oh la la, what is it? Oh, but there are, so you have all these inventors, you see, that that play a very important role and become rich because they invent. Mr. Skype became rich because he invented Skype. Okay, but the thing with innovation is that it has the virtue of increasing social mobility. Why is that? It's because the creative destruction. New firms replace old firms, and that creates turnover. And that turnover generates social mobility, particularly innovation by new entrants, by people who did not innovate before, create social mobility. So you see, innovation has two opposite effects on inequality. On the one hand, it increases top income inequality because when you innovate, you get innovation rents, as I said before. But on the other hand, innovation generates creative destruction, which pushes social mobility. And as a result of all that, innovation doesn't increase broad inequality. Here I show you, that's from chapter 6 of the book. I show you, it's based on US cross-state US panel data. And on the horizontal axis, I show the innovation intensity of a given state in a given year. So the same state of the US can be in different parts of that line from one year to another. Okay. And on the vertical axis, I show the top income, the share of income of the top 1% income earners in that state, in that year. Or I show the bottom 99% Gini, which is the global measure of inequality in that state, in that year. And what you see is that you see a positive relationship between innovation and top income, okay, exactly as I said before. And you can show that this relationship is causal, that it goes from innovation into top income share. But on the other hand, you see no effect of innovation intensity on the Gini. So you see, innovation is a sort of top income, and it's a good source of top income because it boosts growth, it boosts productivity growth, it also boosts social mobility, and as a result, it does not increase global inequality. So I take innovation as a source of the top income inequality. You see what I mean? Because it's a good source, okay? And now you can see that innovation increases social mobility. Here I look at social mobility measured by the correlation or measured inversely by the correlation between parental income and children's income. And you see that in areas of the US where you have more innovation intensity, you have also more social mobility, less correlation between parent income and children's income. And in fact, what's interesting also is that innovating, that's based on recent work with Blondel, Bergeau, and Griffith. If you look at innovating firms, here I look at the evolution of the wage of an unskilled worker. In an innovating firm, it's the continuous line. In the non-innovating firm, it's the dotted line. You can see first that the wage increases with tenure in both, but it's higher. The wage is always higher at any age of the worker in an innovating firm. And also what's interesting is that the prospect for wage growth is better in an innovating firm than in a non-innovating firm. So not only innovation generates social mobility, not only because of creative destruction, but also because innovating firms create more what we call good jobs, which enhance soft skills That means being reliable, being interactive, and therefore innovating firms gives better prospects for promotion and wage increase to unskilled workers than non-innovating firms do. And that's why innovation altogether is a good source of inequality, because not only it boosts productivity growth, but it boosts social mobility, and therefore it does not increase the global measures of inequality like the Gini. Now, by contrast, lobbying reduces lobbying. It means what? You lobby because you want to prevent entry by new potential competitors. So first, lobbying reduces productivity growth because lobbying is against creative disruption and innovation by newcomers. But also lobbying reduces social mobility because you reduce creative disruption. And as a result, lobbying increases broad inequality. So lobbying is all bad because it's a source of topical inequality, which is bad for growth, which is bad for social mobility. And because it increases both top income inequality and reduces social mobility, so lobbying increases broad inequality. And you can see that. That's the link with the cross-state panel US, lobbying and top income share. Well, it's a source of top income share, but it's also, when you are in the states which lobby the most, it also, the inequality, the global measure of inequality, which is Gini, is also higher. Let's see. Okay, let me take 2 minutes to breathe because I have to take my breath. So now so the first thing the book does is to talk about, to elucidate, to shed light on historical enigma like middle income trap, inequality, takeoff, secular stagnation, etc. There are other enigma, like, for example, the structural change going from agriculture to industry and then services, a number of enigmas, competition, why you have an inverted U relationship between competition and growth. All those enigmas are dealt with the book. Now, the second thing the book does is to question some common wisdoms about what we should do. The first common wisdom is that you should tax robots to protect employment. But that, in fact, is not right. In chapter 3 of the book, and it's joint work with the same authors, Céline Antonin, Simon Bunel, but also Xavier Jaravel. And we show that firms, French firms that automate, they create employment. And why do they create employment? You take several measures of capital and automation. Why do they create employment? Here is robotization. See, all those are measures of automation. Why they create employment? They create employment because it's true that when you automate, you replace manpower by capital goods. So there is an eviction effect or substitution effect. But on the other hand, it turns out that the firms that automate, they become more productive. Because they become more productive, they can lower adjusted price. Because they lower their quality adjusted price, they can increase the size of the market worldwide. And because they increase the size of the market worldwide, sales go up. And export sales in particular go up. And because the demand for their products go up worldwide, they employ more. So this productivity effect more than counteracts the substitution effect. And that's why automation is not a bad thing at all. You steal business, of course, from firms that do not automate, domestic firms or abroad. But the firm that automates creates jobs. And that's something that we want to emphasize, okay? And now taxing robots would be counterproductive because you would prevent domestic firms from automating. And therefore, in fact, those firms, either they would outsource or they would disappear. And they would not be able to increase employment, as I showed here, because they would be discouraged from automating. Okay, so that's not a good idea to tax robots. You see, by the way, when you automate, you steal business. So that's the employment in firms in the same sector, domestic, that do not automate. So you increase employment, but of course you destroy employment in competing firms. Okay, the second common wisdom is that protectionism is the way to regain controls of value chain. That's not what we believe. In fact, you see, with COVID, we looked first before the vaccine. We were going after masks, respirators, and tests, as you remember. And France was lacking all of them. We were missing masks, we were missing tests, and we were missing respirators. And Germany was not actually. And if you look here at the imports and exports of these products, masks, respirators, tests, you do that. Germany is the black curves, France is the gray curves, the triangles are exports, and the circles are imports. You see that Germany was doing a little better than France in 2002, but now Germany has increased both its exports and its imports, and it has now a trade surplus of 20 billion euros on these products. France barely increased either them, you see, and has almost no surplus. But Germany did not achieve that because they put tariffs. No, it's because they invested in innovation. You see, they had good industrial policy and they innovated. And that's how they expanded their market share worldwide. You see, that's the thing. Innovation is at the heart of controlling value chains. You can see France here. I'm showing the distance in terms of triadic patents. The triadic patents are the patents registered in the European Patent Office, US Patent Office, and Japanese Patent Office. And I'm showing where France leads compared to the frontier. The frontier is the country with the highest flow of triadic patents. And I look here at triadic patents in medical and pharmaceutical technologies. France was almost leader in 95. And you see France deteriorates between 95 and 2015. And because France lost on innovation, that France lost market share worldwide. You see, the best way to regain control of value chain is to innovate. If you put tariffs, it's counterproductive, because tariffs, what will happen if I put big tariffs, the destination countries will retaliate. They will reduce, they will close export markets to me and to my domestic firms. And therefore, it will reduce the potential rents from innovation that my domestic firms could realize. And therefore, it will discourage innovation by the domestic firms. And therefore, I will lose even more control of value chains worldwide. You see? So the tariff, aggressive tariffs is a very short-sighted policy, because eventually it closes export markets, and therefore it reduces domestic firms' incentive to innovate, and therefore it reduces innovation by domestic firms, and therefore I lose more ground, I lose more control of global value chains. And it's much better innovation than tariffs as a way to regain control of global value chain. And that we explain in chapter 13 of the book. So I was saying taxing robots, very bad idea. Protectionism and high tariffs to regain control of value chain, very bad idea. Another bad idea is negative growth to stop climate change. Let me take 2 minutes. So some people advocate, say, well, you know, to stop climate change, the best way is negative growth. History proves them right in a sense. You see, here I am showing the evolution of worldwide temperature. And you see that the temperature starts taking off exactly at the time of the takeoff of growth. You remember I showed you the growth takeoff. There's essentially growth is per capita GDP worldwide is 0 up to 1820, and it starts boosting as of 1820. Exactly the same for temperature. And in fact, if you didn't have you know, the revolution, the technological revolution, that's where temperature would be, and now that's where it went. You see what I mean? So so that's the thing. So it's true, historically, growth is the main culprit for global warming. So in that sense, those who propose negative growth, they can argue, rightly so, that growth historically is at the heart of the global warming. Without taking off of growth, we would not have the takeoff of temperature, okay? But should we go back to pre-1820? Should we ignore? Because the revolution and the growth gave us a lot. Life expectancy has gone up a lot. We have much more hygiene in our lives. We have much higher quality of life. We get so much more than we got before. Should we go back to pre-1820? So in fact, you see, there is a natural experiment of negative growth. Which natural experiment? It is the first lockdown. You remember, we didn't have the vaccine yet 2 years ago to prevent, to limit the damage of COVID. The thing we had to do was a lockdown, a big lockdown. You had one in Italy and we had one in France. Between March and May, June 2020, GDP went down by 35% in France. CO2 emissions went down by 8%. So if we had to rely only on negative growth to fight climate change, it means we should be permanently in the first lockdown. But you remember, it had terrible side effects. We had to do it at the time. We had no choice. But there were terrible side effects in terms of, the youth, for example, the young citizens. They were extremely schooling, violence within households. There were terrible side effects of the lockdown. I mean, it would have been unbelievable that we prolonged the lockdown. A much better way to fight climate change is that here I show so that historically growth, of course, has to do with climate change. China and India have CO2 emissions that start taking off exactly where the growth started. But is it the reason to go into permanent lockdown? No. The best way is green innovation. You should innovate green. What does it mean? In a green source of energy, in better ways of producing that saves on energy. We should innovate in our housing. We should innovate in transports. We should innovate in our methods of working, do much more work from home. We should innovate in our habits. That's the way out. The way out is to innovate in all dimensions of our life. The problem is that firms that innovated in dirty technologies in the past continue to innovate in dirty technologies in the future. You tend to continue doing what you are good at doing. We deal with this green innovation in chapter 9 of the book, and we show this phenomenon of past dependence. It means that you depend on what you've done before. And we look particularly at the automobile industry. That's the work with De Chellepret, Emus, Martin, and Van Rienen. We show that firms that innovated more in dirty technologies in the past spontaneously tend to continue to innovate more in dirty technology in the future. So that first implies that creative destruction is a good thing, because new firms, they don't have this past dependence problem because they are new firms. So you should favor creative destruction. That's already a way to get green innovation. But also the state has policy instruments to encourage green innovation. Carbon tax, carbon price, of course, is a way. And another one is also industrial policy and subsidies to green innovation, okay, and to green technologies, that the state can play a big role. But as we explain in the book, also civil society can play a big role. Consumers play a big role, you see. What am I doing here? Okay, that's consumers can do a big role. Why? Because consumers, they can, if they are told that this firm is a dirty innovator, that this firm produces dirty, uses dirty inputs, and that's known by the consumers, in countries where consumers care about the environment, they will shy away from these bad citizen firms, and they will redirect their consumption towards virtuous firms. So we show in the book, and it's based on work with Benabou, Roulet, and Martin, that in fact the combination of awareness of consumers about environment and competition makes firms innovate greener. Because if I don't, Claudio is there, suppose Claudio is virtuous and I'm not, and consumers in our country worry about the environment. If I am monopoly, even if I'm not virtuous, they have no choice but purchasing from me. But if now I have the competition of Claudio with a virtuous firm, then even if I'm not virtuous, I will innovate green, because if I don't, I will lose my consumers to Claudio. And therefore, I escape competition through green innovation. It's the same idea of escape competition that I mentioned before. But this escape competition effect is a big force that induces firms to innovate greener. So you see, what's very interesting is that firms do not spontaneously innovate green. The state has a role to play, but civil society, and in particular consumers, also have a role to play to induce firms to innovate greener. And that's, I think, a big source of hope in this fight against climate change. And I think really very much is from green innovation that the solution will come, but together with these incentives, which come from carbon price, from subsidies to green innovation, from smart industrial policy, and this combination, the role of consumers and civil society that I just talked about. Okay, and that's about the green innovation. And you see again the problem of the incumbent firms. They are a barrier to green innovation. You could be pessimistic like Schumpeter. He was not concerned about environment, but you could also be pessimistic because of the past dependence. But there again, there are forces that can be activated, both from the state, on the state side, and on the civil society side. Okay. Now I get to the last part. Give me 2 minutes and I get to the last part of what the book does. Okay. So the last thing the book does is to help us rethink capitalism. In fact, COVID was a revelator. It shows the extent to which the social model of the US is not appropriate. But it shows also the extent to which the innovation ecosystem in Europe is far below the efficiency frontier. Okay. So for example, here I'm showing you, and that's come from all what I talk about comes from the chapter 12, 14, 15, and conclusion of the book. The black curves are the Germany. The gray curves are US. The triangles are the share of population unemployed. You see that unemployment goes up a lot in the US during COVID. But the circle curves show the fraction of population without health insurance. And you see that in the US, this fraction goes down because of Obamacare, but it goes up again with COVID. Why? Because when you lose your employment in the US, you have some probability of losing also health insurance. So at the time where precisely all US citizens needed health support, healthcare, some of them lost access to health, okay, because they lost their employment. In Germany, it's like in Italy or in France, everybody access healthcare throughout. So you see, in that respect, US is not good at ensuring the most vulnerable citizens against a shock like COVID. Again, here I show the share of population at the risk of poverty, Germany versus US. This share increases in the US during COVID. It's constant in Germany, and I could show you Italy. It's like Germany. Okay, so in that sense, the US social model is not good. Another thing I will show you is the number of deaths of despair. So that's work by Deaton and Case, and we talk about that in chapter 11 of the book, actually. And what I show you here is the number of deaths of middle-aged, unskilled, white non-Hispanics between 50-54 age. Okay, age 50-54. And we see that the mortality rate from this group of population, white non-Hispanics, unskilled, age between 50 and 54 years old, increases sharply in the US since 2000. It decreases in Italy, Germany, France. It increases slightly in the UK, which is a bit like the US, but not that much. And in fact, we explain in chapter 11, and it's very much the work of Case and Deaton, it's death of despair. Those are people that are under fear of unemployment. They know that if they get unemployed, they may lose healthcare, they may get into poverty, as I told you before, they lose status. So there is enormous stress. This stress makes them consume opioids, sleeping pills, antidepressants. They start eating pizzas, but too many pizzas, and they become fat. And that's why they die. There's a death of despair. And you don't have that in Europe, most European countries and continental Europe, okay? And that's the bad side of the US. So the US is not good at insuring against big risks like COVID, but they are not good also against insuring against idiosyncratic risks like losing your job. And with the consequence that you have this rise in the death of despair. That's where US is really bad and Europe is better, okay? Now, if you, on the flip side, is that the US is much better when it comes to innovation. Here I'm showing you the number of triadic patents divided by million inhabitants, okay? And you see that US triadic patents, remember, is those good patents that are registered in the US Patent Office, European Patent Office, and Japanese Patent Office. Those are the important patents. And you have much more of them per million inhabitants in the US, the blue curve, than in Europe, 27, the green curve, or China, the red curve. You can look at that. I mean, you can look at number of patents per million inhabitants, US above everybody, number of top 5 patents. You see top 5 patents. You see that's the US way above. Percentage of top 5 cited patents, much higher in the US than elsewhere. You see what I mean? They are very, very good. For example, in biotech, I go here up to 2016, but the numbers are very similar nowadays. Again, if you look at the number of biotech patents per million inhabitants, US is way above everybody else. Why is that? Because the US have a fantastic ecosystem of innovation. And we describe it at length in chapter 12 of the book, called Financing Creative Disruption. They first finance very well basic research. They have the very well-funded universities. They have the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health. They also have sponsors institutions like the Howard Hughes Medical Investigator. All those finance basic research in the US. It's just fantastic what you have at your disposal when you do basic research in the US. No comparison with Europe. Europe now we have the ERC. Fortunately, we have the ERC, but you know we are still well below the US. Then you go from basic research to having a startup. Well, venture capital and business angels and private equity are very helpful, much more developed in the US than in Europe. You become bigger firm, you want to innovate there. Institutional investors like mutual funds, pension funds, much more important in the US than in Europe. So those things are very important. And the thing they also have is the DARPA and the BARDA. So let me tell you in one word what is the DARPA and the BARDA. DARPA is for Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It was created in the 1950s in the area of space and defense to fulfill certain missions. So the basic research has already been done, and you need to turn the basic research into applications in very specific missions. Put a man in space, create this kind of weapons within 1 or 2 years. You have to coordinate actors and resources to turn this basic research into very concrete applications in very well-defined areas. For that, it's good to have the DARPA. The DARPA, the money comes from the ministry. Then the ministry names team leaders, and they have 3 years to fulfill their mission. And they elicit competing projects. So it's a mixture of top-down, the money comes from above, and bottom-up, because the team leader elicits competing projects from below. It's a very modern way and smart way to do industrial policy. So in the US, they did it with the DARPA in the 50s because they were in Cold War and racing with the Soviet Union. Gagarin was in space. They needed to put the Soviet Union had put Gagarin in space. The to save face, the US had to put the man in space within 2 years afterwards. And that's why they had the DARPA and the NASA, all that. But the DARPA, you know, the GPS, the autonomous navigation, the internet are direct or indirect byproducts of DARPA. Then they created ARPA for energy, the US, and they created more recently the BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. If we are all now there, it's thanks to the BARDA. BARDA, the idea was to say, well, we have the RNA messenger technology coming from basic research. We need to turn this into mass production of vaccines within a year. And that's what they did in the US with BARDA. And Johnson, Moderna, Pfizer, etc., were directly or indirectly or at least partly financed through BARDA. And the mass production was done by BARDA. They spent $12 billion on that last year in the US. We know such thing in Europe. And in Europe, we spend on the vaccine and related therapeutics for COVID, $4 billion. And we don't have the equivalent of the BARDA or the DARPA. Okay. And that's something also they have in the US, which is very important. So now, if you look overall, you would like to a capitalism that combines the good side of the American model to be innovative with the good side of the European model to be protective. Some people believe that if you are more innovative, it's at the expense of being more protective and inclusive. And if you choose to be more protective and inclusive, it has to be at the expense of being more innovative. And what I want to argue is that at least 3 policies, flex security, which I will tell you what it is, education and competition, which can make you both more innovative and more inclusive and protective. So flex security on the labor market. I told you already about the death of despair in the US from those who are the unskilled who fear losing their job. But in Denmark, there is no such thing. Work by Alexandra Roulen, all that we talk about in chapter 11 of the book. When you look here, you compare the health of an individual in a firm that does not close down to the health of an identical individual in terms of education, age, experience, and everything in a firm that does not close down. And you see no effect of losing your job on purchase of antidepressants, anti-anxiety, or sleeping pills in Denmark. No effect on probability to visit hospital for circulatory problems. And I didn't show there, no effect on mortality either. Why? Because in Denmark, they put in place a flex security system. When you lose your job for 3 years, you get 90% of your salary. The state helps you find a new job and helps you retrain. And then you rebounce into the labor market and you find a new job. And that's why it's flex security, because you have flexibility. Firms have flexibility to hire and lay off, but it's security for individuals. And that combination of flexibility on the firm side and security on the individual side that we call flex security system. This flex security made Denmark more innovative because you make creative destruction more efficient, but also it made the labor market more protective in Denmark. So here is a reform that made you both more innovative and more protective. The second policy is education. We talk about that in chapter 10 of the book very much. Here we show the probability of inventing as a result, as a function of the income of your parents. So here, the more to the right I am, they mean that your parents are the top income centiles, and here they are in the bottom income. And you see that whether you are in the US current data, US historical data, or Finland, you see this kind of J curve. You are much more likely to innovate if you are your income, parental income is high. Okay, and that's true also in Finland, by the way. Now that was an enigma for us because it's very strange. In Finland, education is of good quality. They have very good PISA tests in particular, and education is totally free in Finland from kindergarten to university. How come you have that J curve? And in fact, we understood that it's because when you in Finland, when you control your parents that earn more are also more educated parents. And what they do is they transmit knowledge and aspirations to their children. When you control for parental education, you see that this J curve in Finland flattens out a lot. So the thing is that parental income matters also in Finland because parental education matters. But on the other hand, the enigma remains. If you had such a good system of education in Finland, parental education either should not matter. And we solved the enigma because, in fact, the big reform of education system in Finland took place in 1970. It's at that time that they had this broad, broadly accessible, high-quality education system. If you restrict attention to researchers born, Finnish researchers born that went through the schooling system after the reform, there is no relationship at all with parental income and the probability of inventing. It's only because most researchers in Finland still went through the schooling system before the reform of 1970 that you have this J curve, you see. So that's an interesting thing. So now, why is that interesting? It's saying, well, you know, in our countries, we have many what we call lost Einsteins. They are very smart kids. They could be inventors, but they are born to the wrong families where the parents cannot, you know, give them the knowledge and aspirations to become inventors. So the solution, so you have a lot of lost Einsteins. The way out is to have more education, to do like the education reform of Finland. You do a reform like this and you maintain it for several generations in a row, you will make the economy more innovative because more people can become innovators. There will be less lost Einsteins. But at the same time, you make the economy more inclusive because more people can innovate. So here again, education reform is one that makes you both more innovative and more inclusive. And finally, competition. Competition, you remember when I talk about secular stagnation in the US, I told you that a way to avoid to have growth resume in the US is to boost competition, to let new entrants come. Because I told you that a reason why you have low growth in the US is because entry of non-superstar firms went down. So if I can neutralize the superstar firms and boost growth and entry of new innovators, I will boost growth. There will be more innovation and more growth in the US. But at the same time, growth will be more inclusive because remember that entrant innovation boosts social mobility. We saw that before. So by reforming competition policy, you make you boost growth, you boost innovation-based growth, and at the same time you boost social mobility because you favor entrant innovation. You see that you have policies like exactly like I said before, flex security, education, competition that is both boost innovation-based growth and boost social, make the economy more inclusive. So now I conclude. You remember the pessimism of Schumpeter. He said, well, the problem is that yesterday's innovators will turn into entrenched conglomerates to prevent new innovations. One solution there is to have the state with competition policy that makes sure that, you know, new conglomerates cannot, prevent new entry. But as we saw when we talked about a middle income trap, firms can buy out the state, they can bribe the state, and they can corrupt the state. And the way out of that, first is to have a good judiciary power. We discussed that in chapter 15 of the book. If you have the judiciary power with that's Montesquieu, and the judiciary power can control the executive. You had that in Italy, no? Berlusconi had a lot of problems with the judges, okay? And that you can go far with that already. But we believe that beyond that, you need civil society. Why do you need civil society? You need civil society because in many places, the state, including the judges, can be bribed by the firms. And to limit the scope for that, you need civil society. Why do we need civil society? Because constitutions are incomplete contracts. That's based on my work with Bolton and Alberto Alesina and Francisco Trevi. And we talk about that in chapter 15 of the book. Constitutions are incomplete contracts. Colombia has the same constitution as France. But being a union leader in Colombia is quite risky. You may be killed with high probability. Not in France, not in Italy. Okay? Italy has a very similar constitution to France and to Colombia. But you prefer to be a union leader in Italy or France than being a union leader in Colombia. But why? Is because the constitution, there is no guarantee they will be enforced. And that's where civil society plays a big role as a means of ensuring the effective enforcement of the incomplete contract which constitution represents, you see. And a good example is the fight for civil rights in the US. You had the Civil War in the 19th century between the North and the South. As a reason, the North won against the South, and slavery was abolished. They abolished slavery, and they introduced the 15th Amendment in the US Constitution, giving voting rights to the African Americans. But as you know, this right was not enforced. Southern states in the US used literacy tests in particular to prevent African Americans to vote. And it took the civil rights movement in the US in 1964, which means one century later after the Civil War, that to have the Supreme Court enact the voting act, which would ban the literacy test and allow the African Americans in the South to indeed vote. It took 100 years between the 15th Amendment was introduced and the enforcement of the 15th Amendment. And it took the fight of the civil rights movement. That's the civil society. So the key, this triangle between firms, state, and civil society is key to the process. You need firms to innovate. You need the state to have competition policy, but you need civil society to make sure that competition is enforced. Same thing with green innovation. The green innovation is done by firms, but the state can play a big role with carbon price and industrial policy and subsidy to green innovation. But the civil society, consumers, shareholders, corporate social responsibility can also play a big role in making growth, innovation-based growth greener. You see, so the triangle, and this idea of triangle owes a lot to Bowles and Carlin, but I use it in the book. We use it with my co-authors, talking about creative destruction and green innovation. This triangle is the response to the Schumpeter pessimism, because forces exist. You have the state and you have civil society, and if properly activated, we avert we avert the pessimistic prediction of Schumpeter when this triangle is fully activated. And that's where we follow Gramsci, and we say we are, it's not a Panglossian optimism, it's an optimism of the will, it's an optimism of the fighter. You have potential forces, they have to be activated. Thank you very much. I'm done with this. Thank you.